The invitation felt like a death warrant in his hands. Edward Wallace stood at the window of his study, watching his estate transform into something he barely recognized. Florists hauled arrangements of white roses and orchids through the south entrance. Catering vans lined the circular drive like soldiers at attention. Somewhere below, his son Edward was laughing with the wedding planner, his voice carrying through the vaulted ceilings with the kind of joy Wallace hadn't heard in years. The kind of joy that made his chest tighten with something he'd long ago forgotten how to name. 3 days. 3 days until his only son married a woman whose smile haunted the edges of Wallace's bourbon-soaked memories in ways he couldn't quite explain. He'd dismissed it as paranoia, the occupational hazard of a man who'd built an empire on suspicion and violence. But standing here, surrounded by the trappings of celebration while his private sanctuary remained cold and dark as a tomb, Wallace felt the weight of 30 years pressing against his ribcage. He turned back to his desk, reviewing the security arrangements for what must have been the dozenth time. Cathedral entrances, exit routes, positioning of his men among the guests. Old habits. A man didn't survive 3 decades at the top of the food chain by trusting in happy endings. The knock at his door came sharp and efficient. One of his security team entered without waiting for permission, holding a brown paper package. "Courier just dropped this, sir. Wouldn't give a name. Left before Thompson could question him." Wallace's instincts flared immediately. 30 years of this life had taught him to read danger in the smallest details. An anonymous delivery 3 days before his son's wedding wasn't a coincidence. Nothing was ever a coincidence. "Leave it," he said. And the man disappeared as quietly as he'd come. Wallace approached the package with practiced caution, checking for wires, unusual weight. Anything that suggested his past had finally caught up with him in the most explosive way possible. But there was nothing. Just paper and tape and whatever truth someone wanted him to see. He opened it slowly, and his world tilted on its axis. A single photograph, edges worn with age. The kind of photo that lived in wallets and on mantles. The kind that marked the moments before everything went wrong. A man with warm brown eyes and an easy smile, holding a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. She was laughing, her dark hair catching sunlight, her face pressed against her father's shoulder with absolute trust. Miguel Ramos. The name slammed into Wallace's consciousness like a bullet he'd fired 15 years ago. His hand found the champagne glass on his desk. He drank, and the taste turned to ash in his mouth. The elegant bubbles might as well have been dirt from a grave he'd dug with his own hands. He turned the photograph over, and the neat handwriting stared back at him like an accusation carved in stone. Some debts are paid in blood, others in betrayal. Your son is marrying the daughter of the man you murdered. The warehouse. The smell of oil and rust and fear. Miguel on his knees, hands bound, begging, "Please, Edward, I have a daughter. I would never betray you. Check again, please." The sound of the gunshot still echoed in Wallace's nightmares on the rare occasions he allowed himself to sleep. His hand trembled. Edward Wallace, who'd stared down rival bosses and federal prosecutors without flinching, couldn't hold a photograph steady. He grabbed his phone, fingers moving with muscle memory through the wedding details his son had sent weeks ago. Photos of the happy couple. Aviana in a black dress at some gallery opening. Aviana and Edward on a beach somewhere, laughing. Aviana at Sunday dinner, her hand in his son's, her smile warm and genuine, and Wallace's breath stopped. Those eyes that smile. The way she held her head, slightly tilted, like she was listening to music only she could hear. Miguel had stood exactly that way. Back when Wallace had trusted him with territory negotiations, with family secrets, with things that got men killed. He pulled up the engagement announcement he'd barely glanced at 6 months ago. Edward Evans to wed Aviana Delgado. Delgado, her mother's maiden name, but the photograph in his hand told a different story, written in faded ink on the back. Miguel and Aviana Ramos, 2009. She'd hidden it, changed her name, spent years burying her identity just to get close enough to destroy him through the one thing he actually loved. Wallace reached for his phone, hit a number he'd had memorized for 25 years. My study, now. Victor Kane appeared within 3 minutes, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades anticipating his boss's needs. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his suit immaculate despite the late hour. He'd been Wallace's right hand since before Miguel, before the empire reached its current heights, before everything. Problem? Victor's voice was smooth, controlled. Wallace handed him the photograph without a word, watching his second-in-command's face with the same attention he'd once used to read poker tells in backroom games that ended in blood. Victor studied it, and for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression so brief Wallace almost missed it, something flickered across his features. Recognition? Guilt? It vanished before Wallace could name it. "Who is this?" Victor asked, his tone perfectly neutral. "Miguel Ramos, 15 years ago." Wallace kept his voice flat, emotionless. "The girl is his daughter. The bride," Victor said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "Find out everything. Real name, history, why she's using her mother's maiden name. I want to know what she had for breakfast 10 years ago." Wallace paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "And double security for the wedding. Something tells me we're going to need it." Victor nodded, slipping the photograph into his jacket pocket. "I'll have answers by morning." As Victor turned to leave, the study door burst open. Edward Evans strode in, practically glowing with joy, a bottle of champagne in one hand and wedding color swatches in the other. The contrast between father and son couldn't have been starker. Edward's exuberance against Wallace's stone-cold dread, hope versus history. "Dad, you have to settle this. Aviana wants ivory for the—" Edward stopped mid-sentence, his gaze landing on Wallace's desk where the brown paper wrapping still lay scattered. "What's that?" Wallace moved to block his view, but he was too slow. Edward's hand shot out, faster than his father gave him credit for, and grabbed the photograph that Victor had set down for just a moment. Wallace watched his son's face as the image registered, watched joy drain away like water through broken glass, watched something harder, more knowing, slide into place. "Dad," Edward said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier lightness. Who is that?" The champagne in his hand suddenly seemed obscene, a celebration for a future that might already be ashes. Edward turned the photograph over. "Read the message." His jaw tightened, and Wallace saw himself in that expression, the same ability to hide pain behind a mask of control. "You knew her father?" Edward's question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Wallace met his son's eyes and saw the beginning of everything unraveling. 15 years of carefully buried secrets clawing their way to the surface. 3 days until a wedding that might be a funeral in disguise. "I knew him," Wallace said, his voice cold as the champagne that had tasted like lies. Briefly. The weight of 15 years of secrets pressed down between them. Heavy enough to crush bones, thick enough to suffocate. And somewhere in the mansion below, surrounded by white roses and fairy lights and all the trappings of joy, the daughter of a murdered man was preparing to walk down the aisle toward her revenge. She would have told me. Edward's voice cut through the study like a blade, sharp with conviction, and something that sounded dangerously like desperation. "We tell each other everything." Wallace poured himself another drink, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. His son stood by the fireplace, still clutching that photograph like it was evidence in a trial where he was both defendant and judge. The boy, no, the man, Wallace had to remind himself, looked like someone watching his entire world tilt off its axis in slow motion. "Everything?" Wallace kept his voice level, controlled. Inside, his mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating probabilities and threat assessments the way he'd done for 3 decades. His son was naive, beautifully, devastatingly naive in the way only the children of monsters could be. Raised in luxury, shielded from blood, believing the best of people because he'd never had to bury the worst. People don't change their names back without a reason, Edward. Maybe she wanted to honor her father's memory. Edward set down the photograph with careful deliberation, like it might explode. Maybe it had nothing to do with us. Us, as if Wallace and his son were a unit, as if Edward's hands were as stained as his father's. Wallace felt something twist in his chest. Pride or pain, he couldn't tell anymore. His son still believed in coincidences. Still thought love was enough to wash away sins measured in bodies and blood. "Tell me how you met her," Wallace said quietly. Edward's expression shifted, softening despite the tension crackling between them. "A charity gala, 18 months ago." She was standing in front of this painting, Caravaggio's The Conversion of St. Paul. She said something about how even violent men could find redemption if they were willing to be struck down first. His laugh was bitter. "I thought she was talking about the painting." Wallace closed his eyes briefly. Of course she'd baited the hook with philosophy and beauty, everything his son craved that Wallace's world couldn't provide. He could see it perfectly. Edward, desperate to be different from his father, hungry for someone who spoke of redemption instead of retribution, and Aviana calculating every word, every smile, every touch. The flashback hit Edward like a physical blow, and Wallace could see it playing across his son's face. The memory of that first meeting, now poisoned with new context. Aviana in a black dress that probably cost less than the champagne being served, but somehow outshone every woman in the room. The way their conversation had flowed like water, natural and effortless. How she'd laughed at his jokes, listened to his dreams of running the family's legitimate businesses, of building something clean from dirty foundations. Edward had kept her secret for months, Wallace realized. Hidden the relationship like it was something precious and fragile, something that might shatter if exposed to the harsh light of the Wallace name. The irony must be crushing him now. He'd thought he was protecting her from his family's darkness, never realizing she'd sought it out deliberately. The study door opened without ceremony. Victor Kane moved like smoke, silent and efficient, a tablet in his hands. Preliminary report. Wallace gestured for him to continue, noting how quickly Victor had returned. Too quickly, perhaps, but he filed that observation away for later examination. Aviana Delgado, born Aviana Ramos. Victor's voice was clinical, detached. Used her mother's maiden name from age 18 to 30. Changed back to Ramos 5 years ago, 2 months after her mother, Isabella Delgado, died of cancer. He scrolled through the tablet. Father listed as deceased in all records. Date of death matches the incident 15 years ago. Edward flinched at that careful phrasing. The incident. As if murder could be sanitized with euphemisms. Her career is impressive, Victor continued. Started as a gallery assistant, worked her way up to curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. No criminal record, no suspicious associations, clean as fresh snow. Too clean, Wallace muttered, but Victor was already moving toward the door, his duty discharged. After Victor left, Wallace opened his laptop, a skill his men didn't know he possessed. This digital archaeology that required patience and a certain kind of ruthlessness. He found Aviana's social media profiles, scrolled back 5 years to the week she'd changed her name back. The posts made his blood run cold. Today, I reclaim my father's name. Some truths can't stay buried forever. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I think it's better served with a smile. Honoring my father's memory, truth always surfaces. Some debts must be paid. Most of it had been scrubbed, deleted, buried under layers of gallery openings and art criticism. But Wallace had tools, connections, ways of resurrecting digital ghosts. He found something else, too. Geotagged photos from 3 years ago, the warehouse district. The exact location where Miguel Ramos had died on his knees, begging for mercy Wallace hadn't given. She'd visited 7 times. I knew. Wallace's head snapped up. Edward stood in the doorway, his face pale, but set with determination. I hired someone to do a background check 6 months ago. After I decided to propose, I found out she was Miguel Ramos's daughter. The world stopped. Wallace felt rage and disbelief war in his chest, hot and cold simultaneously. You knew, he repeated, his voice dangerous. And you still proposed? Because I love her. Edward's composure cracked. Because I thought maybe love could heal what you destroyed. Maybe I could be different than you. Maybe I could break the cycle instead of perpetuating it. Wallace stood slowly, every movement controlled. She's using you. This entire relationship is revenge. Can't you see that? Maybe. Edward's voice dropped to something raw and honest. But I'd rather find out on my wedding day than live my whole life wondering if I could have been different than you. I'd rather risk my heart than guarantee becoming the man who pulls triggers first and asks questions never. The words hit like bullets. Wallace saw his son choosing a path that led away from him, away from the empire, away from everything Wallace had built and bled for. And the worst part, the absolutely devastating part, was that he couldn't blame him. Call off the wedding, Wallace said quietly. No, Edward, I won't destroy another person's life because of your sins. Edward's eyes were hard, unforgiving. That's your specialty, not mine. The door slammed behind him, and Wallace was alone again with ghosts and regrets. Victor appeared in the doorway moments later, silent as always. Want me to handle the girl? His voice was carefully neutral. Make her disappear before the wedding? Wallace studied his second-in-command, searching for something he couldn't name. No, I want to know what she's planning. Double the surveillance. Every movement, every call, every breath. Victor's disappointment flickered across his face before the mask returned. Understood. After Victor left, Wallace pulled up files he hadn't looked at in 15 years. Miguel Ramos's betrayal, the evidence that had justified execution, that had seemed so clear, so damning. Bank transfers that proved Miguel was selling territory information to rival families. Recorded conversations where Miguel discussed Wallace's security weaknesses. Witness testimony from Victor about Miguel's midnight meetings with enemies. Wallace read through it all with fresh eyes, eyes that had just seen his son choose love over legacy, redemption over revenge, and the inconsistencies glared at him like accusation. The bank transfers came from an account that didn't exist until after Miguel's death. The recordings were transcripts, not audio, impossible to verify voice authenticity. The witnesses were all Victor's contacts, men who'd died in various gang wars over the years. And Victor, who'd brought every piece of evidence. Victor, who'd been so certain, so convincing. Victor, who'd stood to gain Miguel's position as second-in-command. Wallace's hands began to shake again, but this time not from fear. What if I killed an innocent man? He whispered to the empty room. The photograph of Miguel and his daughter stared back at him. And in the little girl's trusting smile, Wallace saw the answer he'd been avoiding for 15 years. He'd built an empire on a lie, and now his son was about to marry the truth. Before we continue with what happens next, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're hooked on this story like I am, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what Aviana has planned for Wallace. Trust me, things are about to get even more intense. She walked into his study without knocking. Wallace watched her approach on the security monitors, tracking her progress through his estate with the detached interest of a man observing his own execution. She'd told the gate guard she was bringing Edward's wedding gift early, smiled that devastating smile that was pure Miguel Ramos, and they'd waved her through like she belonged there. Like she wasn't walking into the lion's den with nothing but audacity and 15 years of grief as armor. He could have stopped her. Should have, probably. But Wallace had spent the past 24 hours staring at evidence of his own monstrosity, and some part of him, the part that he still remembered being human, wanted to look into the eyes of the daughter whose father he'd murdered and see what justice looked like. The door opened. Aviana Ramos stood in the threshold, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the hallway windows. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry except a thin gold chain that caught the light. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp angles of her face. Miguel's face, refined and feminine, but unmistakably his. "I've been wondering when you'd come," Wallace said, not rising from his desk. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click that sounded like a cell door locking. "I've been coming for 5 years. You just didn't notice." The words hit like a slap. 5 years. While Wallace had been building his empire higher, diversifying into legitimate businesses, convincing himself he'd transcended his violent origins, she'd been circling closer. Patient, deliberate, inevitable. Aviana sat in the chair across from him without invitation, crossed her legs with elegant composure. She looked like she belonged in boardrooms and gallery openings, not in the study of a man who'd killed her father. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd built herself into exactly the kind of woman who could walk into monsters' dens and sit down like she owned them. My father used to tell me you were the smartest man he ever met. Her voice was soft, almost conversational. I'm disappointed it took you this long. Wallace studied her face, cataloging every similarity to Miguel, the defiant tilt of her chin, the steady, unwavering gaze that seemed to see straight through manufactured authority to the rot beneath. Miguel had looked at him that way too in the end, right before the bullet. You engineered the meeting with Edward. Not a question. The charity gala, yes, and every accidental encounter after. She leaned back, completely at ease. I researched your son for 2 years before making contact. Learned his routines, his preferences, his desperate need to be different from you, the son who wanted to be clean. Her smile was sharp. The heir who thought he could escape. Wallace felt something cold settle in his chest. This was always about revenge. Not killing you, if that's what you're thinking. Death is too quick, too merciful. She reached into her bag. Wallace's hand twitched toward his desk drawer, where a gun waited, but she only pulled out a tablet. I wanted you to watch. Every family dinner, every Christmas, every grandchild that carries my blood and your name. You'll see my father's face and remember what you took. She set the tablet on the desk between them, pressed play. Victor Kane's voice filled the study, tinny through the speakers but unmistakable. Miguel's been meeting with the Bratva. I have photos, recordings. He's selling our territory maps. Another voice, younger, uncertain. You're sure about this, Victor? I've been watching him for months. The man's a traitor. You know what has to be done. Wallace's breath stopped. The date stamp on the recording. 2 weeks before Miguel's execution. Aviana swiped to the next file. Bank records, showing transfers from an account that Wallace now recognized had been created posthumously. Witness statements from men who'd conveniently died in the years following Miguel's death. All of them in situations where Victor had been present. Miguel Ramos never betrayed you, Aviana said quietly. Victor Kane framed him. Fabricated evidence, bribed witnesses, manufactured a betrayal to eliminate competition. Impossible. But even as Wallace said it, he knew it wasn't. The inconsistencies he'd noticed last night suddenly formed a pattern, clear and damning. I vetted the evidence myself. You vetted evidence Victor fed you. You trusted him. She paused, letting that sink in, the way my father trusted you. Wallace's world tilted. 15 years of certainty crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. Miguel had been charismatic, brilliant, capable, was being groomed to eventually take over when Wallace retired, something he'd never explicitly said but everyone understood, including Victor, who'd been second in command for 2 decades and saw his position threatened by a younger, more capable successor. The flashback hit with the force of a bullet. The warehouse. Oil-stained concrete and the smell of rust and fear. Miguel on his knees, hands bound behind his back, blood trickling from his split lip where one of Wallace's men had hit him for protesting innocence. Edward, please. Miguel's voice breaking. I have a daughter. She's 10 years old. I would never betray you. Check again, please. Look at the evidence again. Wallace, standing over him with a gun that felt heavier than it should. I don't give second chances to traitors. I'm not. Miguel's eyes, desperate and pleading. Please, for Aviana, if you have any mercy. The gunshot, louder than thunder in that enclosed space. Miguel's body falling forward, and Wallace turning away before he had to see the light leave those eyes that looked at him not with guilt, but with heartbroken betrayal. The betrayal of a man who'd trusted wrong, who'd believed in honor among thieves. Wallace had carried that look for 15 years, buried it under empire building and profit margins and the lie that it had been necessary. I don't want you dead, Aviana said, pulling him back to the present. Death is peace. I want you to live with what you did. Then why tell me the truth? Wallace's voice was rough. Why show me this? Because of your son. Her composure cracked, just slightly. I came here to destroy you, by stealing him. But Edward is good, actually good, not naive, not weak, genuinely good in a way I didn't think was possible for someone raised in your world. Wallace saw the conflict in her eyes. The war between vengeance and something else. Something softer and more dangerous. I fell in love with him, she admitted. Somewhere between the calculated touches and the rehearsed conversations, it became real. So now I'm trapped. I love a man whose father murdered mine. And tomorrow I marry him, knowing it will torture you forever. Her laugh was bitter. Congratulations, Edward Wallace. You've managed to make even revenge complicated. Before Wallace could respond, the door burst open. Victor Kane stood there, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his eyes moving between Wallace and Aviana with cold calculation. Boss, we need to talk, now. Wallace saw it then, clear as day. Victor's hand hovering near his jacket, where Wallace knew he kept a weapon. Victor's focus locked on Aviana with the intensity of a man seeing a threat that needed eliminating. Victor, get out! Wallace's voice cut like steel. This doesn't concern you. Victor's mask slipped. Everything concerning this family concerns me. I've given 30 years. Get out! The power struggle played out in silence. Victor's jaw worked, his hand still near his weapon. For a moment, Wallace thought his second-in-command might actually draw, might force this confrontation here and now. Then Victor's gaze landed on the tablet on the desk, and something cold and knowing passed across his face. As you wish. Victor turned, but his parting look at Aviana promised violence. See you at the wedding. The door closed. Wallace and Aviana sat in the heavy silence. The wedding is canceled, Wallace said finally. No, Victor will try to kill you tomorrow, during the ceremony. Aviana's smile was sharp and terrible. I know. I'm counting on it. Understanding crashed over Wallace like ice water. She'd planned this. All of it. The confrontation, the evidence, forcing Victor's hand. She wanted the violence, needed it to justify whatever endgame she had in mind. Does Edward know? Wallace asked quietly. That you're using him as bait? Her silence answered everything. Then we have something in common, Wallace said. We've both lied to my son. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the estate where his son was somewhere planning a future that might end in blood and betrayal. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 15 years of mistakes. The question is, which of us loves him enough to tell him the truth? Edward found them in the study, surrounded by ghosts. He'd been looking for Aviana, following the trail of dropped hints from security guards who'd seen her arrive. But when he pushed open the door to his father's sanctuary, What he found was something worse than absence. He found the truth, laid out on a tablet screen with his father and fiancé on opposite sides of the desk, like generals negotiating terms of war. Miguel's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable even through the years. "Edward, please, I have a daughter. I would never betray you." Edward stood frozen in the doorway, watching his father's face drain of color, watching Aviana's composure crack just slightly. The recording played on, damning and desperate, and Edward felt his world crystallize into something sharp and cutting. "How long have you both been lying to me?" His voice was quiet, but it stopped them both mid-breath. Wallace reached for the tablet, silencing Miguel's ghost. Aviana stood, one hand extended like she might touch him, might bridge the distance between calculation and truth. Edward stepped into the study and closed the door. Whatever happened next, it needed to happen here, in this room where his father had built an empire on blood, and his fiancée had built revenge on patience. "All of it," Wallace said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years. "Everything you think you know about Miguel Ramos, I was wrong. He never betrayed the family. Victor framed him and He paused, and Edward saw something he'd never seen in his father's face before. Shame, raw and unfiltered. "I killed an innocent man." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Edward had known his father was a killer. You didn't build the Wallace empire with handshakes and good intentions. But this was different. This was murder dressed as justice, violence wrapped in the lie of necessity. "You didn't verify?" Edward heard himself ask, his voice distant. "You just executed him?" "Yes." No excuses, no justifications about the nature of their world or the cost of leadership. Just that single syllable, heavy as a headstone. Edward turned to Aviana, and she met his gaze without flinching. "The charity gala," he said. "Our first meeting. You engineered it." "Yes." Her voice was steady, but something flickered in her eyes. "I researched you for 2 years. Learned everything about you. Chose you deliberately because you were the son who wanted to escape, who believed he could be different." She stepped closer. "I planned our meeting, our relationship, everything. It was revenge." "Was?" The word scraped his throat raw. "I didn't plan to fall in love with you." Her composure fractured, and Edward saw the woman beneath the calculated exterior. The daughter who'd spent 15 years carrying grief like a second skeleton. "Meeting you was strategy. Falling for you was—" She swallowed hard. "I don't know when it changed, but it did. It became real." Edward's laugh was bitter, broken. "Was any of it real, either of you?" Wallace moved around the desk, and for the first time in Edward's memory, his father looked old, mortal. "My love for you is the only real thing in my life. That's why this hurts." Somewhere, in another wing of the estate, Victor Kane made his third call of the evening. His voice was low, efficient, the tone of a man who'd orchestrated coups before. "Cathedral East entrance. Position your team there. When it happens, it needs to look like the Volkov family. Make sure there are bodies on both sides." He paused, listening. Both targets, the girl and the boy. Wallace won't survive losing his son, and if he does, he'll be weak enough to eliminate. Victor ended the call and stared out at the estate grounds, at the white tents being erected for the reception, at the security teams doing their rounds. 30 years he'd given to Wallace. 30 years of being second best to men with more charisma, more vision, more of whatever quality made Wallace trust them over him. Miguel had been the first. There would be others, Victor knew, unless he took what should have been his all along. Tomorrow, during the ceremony, while everyone's attention was on vows and romance, his men would move. Swift, brutal, final. He pulled out a list of names, Wallace's most loyal men. They'd need to be positioned away from the cathedral, sent on fake security details, scattered and useless. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be over. Victor smiled. After tomorrow, the Wallace Empire would have a new king. Back in the study, Edward stood at the window, looking out at the same grounds Victor was watching. His hands were steady, his voice cold. "I'm going through with the wedding." "Edward," Wallace started, "tomorrow, as planned. Are you insane?" Wallace moved toward him. "Victor will try to kill Aviana. Possibly you too. I can't protect. Let him try." Edward turned, and Wallace saw something new in his son's face. Something hard and tactical and terrifyingly familiar. "I'm done running from what this family is. Done pretending I can be clean while you're dirty, while people die in our name whether I acknowledge it or not." Aviana stepped forward. "Edward, we can cancel everything. I have evidence, recordings, documents, witness testimony. I can turn it all over to the FBI. Your father pays for what he did and you walk away clean." "There is no clean." Edward's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you see? I've been lying to myself, pretending distance and legitimate business made me different. But I've always known what he was, what this family was built on. I just didn't want to face it." Wallace studied his son, seeing pieces of himself in that rigid posture, that cold calculation. "You want to force the confrontation. You built an empire on violence, Dad. Fine. Tomorrow we end it with violence." Edward's jaw set. "The wedding becomes a trap, not for us, for Victor. We bring everything into the open, and we finish this." "You have more of me in you than you want to admit," Wallace said quietly. "I know." Edward's voice dropped to something raw. "That's what terrifies me." Aviana moved between them, her gaze sharp. "I've been gathering evidence for 2 years, not just on Victor, on all of it, the entire organization, every illegal operation, every payoff, every body." She looked at Wallace. "Tomorrow, one way or another, the Wallace Empire ends. The only question is whether you go down as a monster or as a father who tried to save his son." Wallace accepted this with the calm of a man who'd been preparing for judgment his entire life. "If I die tomorrow, stopping Victor, make sure it meant something. Make sure Edward gets out." They stood there, 3 people with 3 different endgames, unified only by the common enemy planning their deaths in another wing of the estate. It was Aviana who finally spoke, her voice steady. "We'll need a plan. Position your loyal men carefully. Victor will try to isolate us, so we need backup in places he won't expect." Wallace nodded. "I'll personally vet every security position. Anyone I can't absolutely trust gets reassigned." "I'll document everything," Aviana said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, there will be a record. Justice or evidence, one way or another." Edward looked between them. The father who'd killed an innocent man and the woman who'd planned revenge disguised as love. "If we're doing this, we do it all the way. No more lies, no more secrets. Whatever happens in that cathedral, it happens in the light." They planned until dawn broke over the estate. each preparing for war in their own way. Wallace retreated to his armory, checking weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd killed before and would kill again if it meant his son survived. He picked up a photograph from his desk. Edward, at age 5, smiling with gap-toothed innocence, before he understood what his father really was. "I'm sorry," Wallace whispered to that innocent face, "for all of it." In her apartment across the city, Aviana sat in the pre-dawn darkness, checking the recording device she'd hidden in her bridal bouquet. Tiny, sophisticated, powerful enough to capture everything. The FBI would get their evidence, one way or another. She thought of Edward's face when he'd learned the truth, the betrayal and love warring in his eyes. "I do love him," she said to her father's photograph on the mantel. "I hope that's enough." The cathedral was empty when Edward arrived, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He walked the aisle slowly, imagining tomorrow, the guests, the guns, the moment when everything either ended or began again. He stood at the altar where he'd planned to say vows of love, and had to prepare for vows of violence. The stained glass windows caught the first light of dawn, painting the floor in shattered rainbows. A sacred space, about to become a battlefield. Edward closed his eyes and made peace with whoever might be listening. "Some weddings are about love," he whispered to the empty cathedral. "Mine will be about survival." The cathedral was a masterpiece of calculated deception. Light streamed through stained glass windows, painting the gathered guests in jewel tones, crimson and sapphire and gold that would hide bloodstains beautifully. 300 people filled the pews, a carefully curated mix of legitimate business contacts who thought they were attending a society wedding and mob associates who knew better but came anyway. They wore their finest suits and dresses, diamonds glittering at throats and wrists, completely unaware they were sitting in a powder keg. Aviana stood in the vestibule, her wedding dress a masterpiece of white silk and lace, the bouquet of white roses and orchids trembling slightly in her hands. Not from nerves, from the weight of the recording device hidden among the flowers, sophisticated enough to capture everything, small enough to remain invisible. She looked like a bride, she felt like a weapon. Edward waited at the altar, his tuxedo pressed to perfection, his hands clasped in front of him in a pose that looked meditative but was actually tactical. His eyes scanned the faces in the pews, cataloging threats and allies. His father's men were positioned exactly as planned, scattered throughout the crowd, concealed weapons ready. Victor's men were there too. Edward could spot them by the way they watched the exits instead of the altar. In the front pew, Wallace sat with the rigid posture of a general going to war. The weapon beneath his jacket pressed against his ribs with every breath, a constant reminder of what this day would cost. He'd killed men before, would kill again if it meant Edward survived, but sitting in this sacred space, surrounded by organ music and flower arrangements and the trappings of joy, Wallace felt the weight of Miguel Ramos's ghost pressing down on his shoulders. Victor Kane sat 3 rows back, playing the role of loyal second-in-command with practiced ease. He smiled at arriving guests, nodded at the appropriate moments, looked for all the world like a man celebrating his boss's son's happiness. But his men were in position. 2 in the choir loft, 3 behind the columns, 3 more controlling the exits. 8 total, heavily armed, waiting for his signal. The organ swelled. Aviana began her walk down the aisle. The priest stood at the altar, his weathered face serene, despite the tension that seemed to press against the vaulted ceilings. He'd married dozens of couples in his 40 years of service, but something about this ceremony felt different, wrong, like watching a lamb walk toward slaughter dressed in silk and promises. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Edward Evans and Aviana Ramos. Ramos, not Delgado." Aviana had insisted on using her real name for the ceremony, and Wallace had felt that choice like a knife between his ribs. If anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was suffocating. Edward felt it pressing against his chest, saw guests shifting uncomfortably, sensing something they couldn't name. Wallace's hand moved subtly toward his weapon. The moment passed. The priest continued. "Edward Evans, do you take Aviana Ramos to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Edward's voice was steady, strong. "I promise to honor the truth even when it costs everything, to break the chains of the past, no matter what blood must be spilled." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Those words weren't standard vows, but Wallace understood, and so did Aviana, and somewhere in the third row, Victor's smile turned cold. "Aviana Ramos, do you take Edward Evans to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice didn't waver. "I promise to carry my father's memory without being consumed by it. To choose love over vengeance, even when vengeance is deserved." The double meanings hung in the air like gun smoke. Wallace saw Victor's jaw tighten, saw his hand move to his jacket. Then, by the power vested in me, the priest said, "I now pronounce you." "Stop." Victor stood, the word cutting through the ceremony like a blade. The cathedral fell silent. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward him. "This wedding is a lie." Victor's voice carried to every corner of the sacred space. His hand emerged from his jacket, holding a weapon. "Nobody move. This is family business." The doors slammed shut simultaneously. East, west, north. Locked from the outside. Victor's men emerged from their positions, weapons drawn. Guests screamed, some diving under pews, others frozen in terror. The sacred space transformed into something else entirely, something ancient and violent. Wallace was already moving, gun drawn, positioning himself between Victor and his son. "The only traitor here is you, Victor." Victor's smile was cold, triumphant. "You killed Miguel because I told you to, and you never questioned it." He gestured to his men, who fanned out, controlling the space. 15 years, Edward. 15 years I fed you lies, shaped your decisions, made you dance like a puppet. This empire, it's mine. I just let you think you were in charge. The confession hung in the air, and Wallace saw it then, the scope of his own blindness, the decades of manipulation he'd been too arrogant to see. "I made you a murderer," Victor continued, his weapon steady. "And now I'm taking what should have been mine all along." The first shot came from the choir loft, aimed at Edward. Wallace's loyal men returned fire immediately, and the cathedral erupted into chaos. Bullets tore through air, through wood, through the stained glass windows that had stood for centuries. Shards of colored glass rained down like deadly confetti, and the screaming intensified as guests scrambled for cover. Edward threw himself over Aviana, his body covering hers as they hit the marble floor. A bullet passed through the space where his head had been a second before, embedding itself in the altar. Wallace moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who'd been a killer before he'd been a king. He took down one of Victor's men with 2 shots, center mass, professional, final. The body dropped behind a column as Wallace advanced, using pews for cover, moving toward Victor with single-minded purpose. Edward pulled Aviana behind the altar. Relatively protected. "Stay down," he commanded. "Edward." But he was already moving, grabbing a weapon from one of Victor's fallen men. Aviana watched as her husband— was he her husband? The ceremony hadn't finished. Entered the firefight with the same cold calculation she'd seen in his father's face. He aimed for legs, for shoulders, still trying to wound rather than kill. Still trying to be different even while accepting that violence was necessary. He took down one of Victor's men who'd been targeting fleeing civilians, the shot precise and controlled. The man fell, clutching his shoulder, weapon clattering away. Edward's face was pale but determined, and Aviana felt something break and rebuild simultaneously in her chest. Wallace cornered Victor on the cathedral steps, between the altar and the entrance. Bodies littered the marble around them, 6 dead, more wounded, the price of ambition made visceral and real. Blood pooled in the grooves of the carved floor, filling the decorative patterns with crimson. "You should have let me kill you years ago," Victor snarled, circling. "Too sentimental, too weak." "Weakness would be letting you destroy my son." Wallace's voice was ice and fury. They came together with brutal force, years of partnership twisted into violence. Wallace's gun went flying, knocked from his hand by Victor's calculated strike. They fought hand to hand, vicious and personal, each knowing the other's moves from 3 decades of fighting side by side. Victor got the upper hand, slamming Wallace against the marble steps. A knife appeared in his hand. Where it had come from, Wallace didn't see, and suddenly the blade was at his throat, pressing just hard enough to draw blood. "Any last words, old man?" "My father's last words were, 'I have a daughter. Remember those?'" Aviana's voice cut through the chaos. She stood 10 feet away, Wallace's gun in her steady hands, aimed directly at Victor's head. Blood streaked her white dress. Glass shards caught in her veil like diamonds. She looked like a vengeful angel, beautiful and terrible. Victor spun, bringing the knife around, but Wallace used the distraction. He broke Victor's grip with a move he'd learned in back alleys 40 years ago, twisted, and suddenly the knife was between them. Both men's hands on the handle, struggling for control. Wallace looked up, past Victor's snarling face, and saw Aviana watching. Saw Miguel's eyes in hers, the same dark intensity, the same capacity for both love and judgment. In that moment, Wallace made his choice. He drove the knife home, personal and brutal, the blade sliding between Victor's ribs with the sick ease of a man who'd done this before. Victor's eyes went wide with shock, then pain, then nothing. His body collapsed, falling forward onto Wallace, and they went down together in a mockery of embrace. Wallace shoved the corpse away, stood on shaken legs. Victor lay on the cathedral steps exactly as Miguel had lain in that warehouse 15 years ago, on his knees first, then falling forward, life draining into marble. The silence that followed was broken only by sobbing guests and the distant wail of sirens. 6 bodies, not including Victor. Wallace's men had taken down 5 of Victor's 8. The other 2 had fled when they'd seen their boss fall. Aviana lowered the gun, approached slowly. For one terrible moment, Wallace thought she might shoot him anyway, finish what should have been finished 15 years ago. Instead, she stopped 3 feet away, still holding the weapon, her wedding dress ruined with blood and violence. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for protecting him." The complexity of it crashed over Wallace. Her gratitude for saving Edward twisted together with her rage for killing Miguel, all of it impossible to separate. Edward emerged from behind the altar, white-faced and shaking, the weapon still in his hands. He looked at his father, really looked, and saw what Wallace had always been beneath the empire and the expensive suits. A killer. Efficient, brutal, and absolutely devoted to his son. "Is this what you wanted for me?" Edward's voice cracked. "To become this? No." Wallace dropped his own weapon, the clatter echoing in the blood-stained cathedral. "I wanted you to be free, that's why I'm ending it." The sirens grew louder. Through the shattered stained glass windows, Wallace could see SWAT teams taking positions, megaphones calling for surrender. He turned to his remaining men, scattered throughout the cathedral. "Stand down, drop your weapons, all of you." They obeyed without question, guns clattering to marble. Wallace started toward the entrance, toward surrender, toward whatever justice waited outside this ruined sacred space. But before he could take more than 3 steps, Aviana's voice stopped him cold. "Wait." Outside, police radios crackled with terse commands. Body bags were being unloaded from vans, crime scene tape unfurling like ribbon at a macabre celebration. But inside the cathedral, Wallace stood facing his son and the woman who was almost his daughter-in-law, Victor's blood still warm on his hands. "Before you go," Aviana said quietly, "I need you to say it. All of it. No more euphemisms, no more calling it business or necessity. The truth." Wallace looked at the bouquet she still clutched, at the way her fingers pressed against one particular rose. He'd been in this game long enough to recognize a recording device when he saw one hidden. She'd planned this, too, every moment choreographed toward this confession. He could refuse, could walk out that door and let lawyers handle whatever came next. But looking at Edward's face, pale and devastated, and trying so hard to understand how to love a monster, Wallace realized he owed them both more than silence. "Miguel Ramos," he began, his voice carrying through the blood-stained cathedral, "was a good man. Loyal, capable, everything I valued in my organization. When Victor brought me evidence of his betrayal, I should have questioned it more thoroughly. Should have given him a chance to defend himself." He paused, the weight of 15 years pressing down. "Instead, I took him to a warehouse, had my men bind him, and when he begged, when he said he had a daughter who needed him, I told him I don't give second chances to traitors." Edward's hand found Aviana's, squeezed. Wallace saw it and continued. "I shot him once. Clean, professional. He died quickly, if that matters." Wallace's voice cracked. "But his eyes, God, his eyes looked at me with such betrayal, not guilt, just confusion and heartbreak that I didn't believe him. I've carried that look for 15 years, buried it under every business deal, every legitimate venture, Every lie I told myself about building something better. The confession poured out like poison from a wound. 30 years of terrible decisions, of people who disappeared because they'd become inconvenient, of lives destroyed so the Wallace Empire could flourish. Names, dates, methods, all of it recorded by the device in Aviana's bouquet. I thought I was building something for you, Edward. Wallace met his son's eyes. A legacy, a future. But I was just building a tomb, a beautiful, expensive tomb filled with ghosts. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the police radio seemed to quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Wallace pulled out his gun. His remaining men tensed, but he held it by the barrel, offering it to Aviana. Then he knelt before her, there on the blood-stained marble, a king abdicating to the daughter of the man he'd murdered. Your father died begging for mercy I didn't give. His voice was steady despite everything. Take my life now, or let this wedding bind us in blood forever. Your choice. I won't make his mistake. I won't rob you of agency the way I robbed him of his life. Aviana took the gun, the weight of it familiar in her hands. Wallace watched her finger move to the trigger, saw 15 years of rage and grief crystallize into this single moment. Edward stood frozen, and Wallace saw him make a choice too, to not interfere, to let this be Aviana's decision alone. The moment stretched. Outside, police radios crackled. Inside, 300 witnesses held their breath. Aviana lowered the gun. Death would be too easy, she said, her voice carrying the weight of mercy and cruelty intertwined. You'll give me away at this wedding. You'll stand where my father should have stood, and every day after, you'll remember what you took from me. That's my revenge. She held his gaze, and Wallace saw both his damnation and something else, something that looked almost like forgiveness beginning to take root in poisoned soil. My father wouldn't want me to become you, she continued quietly. He believed in redemption, even for men who didn't deserve it. She handed the gun back to Wallace. The ceremony isn't finished. We have vows to complete. Wallace stared at her, this woman who held his life in her hands and chose mercy over vengeance. You can't be serious. The priest is still here. Aviana gestured to where the elderly man sat in the front pew, looking shell-shocked but steady. We're finishing this, all of it. The priest stood on shaking legs, moved back to the altar. The guests who'd remained, maybe 50 of the original 300, the curious and the trapped, watched in stunned silence as Aviana took Wallace's arm. Walk me down the aisle, she commanded. Give me away. It's the least you owe my father. Each step was agony. Wallace saw Miguel in every feature of the woman beside him. The determined set of her jaw, the grace in her stride, the capacity for both strength and mercy. He remembered the photograph. Miguel and his daughter smiling in sunshine before Wallace had destroyed everything. The blood-stained aisle stretched before them like a path through hell. Broken glass crunched under their feet. Bodies lay covered by jackets, awaiting removal. The sacred space had been desecrated, but somehow, impossibly, they were continuing the ceremony. Edward waited at the altar, his face a mask of complicated emotions. When Wallace and Aviana reached him, the priest cleared his throat. Who gives this woman to be married? Wallace's voice broke on the first word, but he pushed through. I do, in memory of her father, Miguel Ramos, a good man I wronged. the public confession witnessed by everyone who remained. Wallace handed Aviana to Edward, their fingers brushing in the transfer, and felt something pass between them. Responsibility, legacy, hope. The weight he'd carried for 30 years shifting to younger, stronger shoulders. "Edward Evans," the priest continued, his voice surprisingly steady. "Do you take this woman?" "I promise to break every chain my father forged," Edward interrupted, looking only at Aviana. "To build something new from these ashes, to be better than the legacy I inherited." "Aviana Ramos, do you take this man?" "I promise to carry my father's memory without being consumed by it," she said. "To choose love over vengeance, even when vengeance would be easier. To end cycles instead of perpetuating them." "Then by the power vested in me," the priest said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Their kiss was witnessed by the living and honored dead, a pact sealed in blood and forgiveness. The marriage became something more than the union of two people. It was a declaration that love could exist in the ruins of violence, that new beginnings were possible even on foundations of bones. The small reception happened in a side chapel while police processed the main cathedral. Edward and Aviana stood with the few guests who'd stayed, trying to find normalcy in the aftermath of war. Wallace moved to leave, but Aviana caught his arm. "A word, private." They stepped into a small alcove. Aviana reached into her bouquet, pulled out the recording device, and showed it to Wallace. "I've been working with the FBI for 2 years," she said calmly. "Everything you confessed in there, all of it is recorded. Admissible in court. Enough to put you away for life and collapse your entire organization." Wallace's world tilted one final time. He'd thought mercy meant peace, but it had just been prolonged justice. "So, this was always the plan?" "Yes." She held up the device. "But here's what you're going to do. You have 24 hours to disappear. Leave the business to Edward, the legitimate parts. Walk away from the Empire, and I won't turn this over to my handler. And if I refuse, then your son spends the rest of your life visiting you in prison, watching you die behind bars, never building anything clean because your shadow will always be there." Her eyes were hard. "You have 24 hours. Exile or imprisonment. Choose." Wallace looked past her to where Edward stood, trying to smile at well-wishers, trying to find joy in the wreckage. His son. The only thing he'd ever done right. 24 hours, Wallace agreed. "If you ever come back, if you ever threaten him or try to reclaim what you've lost, the FBI gets everything." Aviana's voice was ice. "Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly." Wallace found Edward in the cathedral proper, staring at the blood-stained altar where he'd just been married. His son didn't turn when Wallace approached, but his shoulders tensed. "I'm leaving," Wallace said quietly. "Tonight." "I know." Edward's voice was hollow. "She told me what she offered you." "I don't forgive you," Edward said, finally turning. "For Miguel, for the Empire, for raising me in a world built on violence and calling it love. I don't forgive any of it." "Good." Wallace felt something in his chest crack. "Don't forgive me. Be better than me." That's all I ever really wanted. They embraced, and Wallace felt his son shaking. Or maybe he was the one shaking. It was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "Take care of her," Wallace whispered. "She's stronger than both of us." "I know," Edward said. "That's why I love her." Dawn broke over the city as Wallace sat in the back of a car, a single bag beside him, no security, no empire, no identity beyond what he'd carried inside all along. Through the tinted window, he watched federal agents raid his properties. Arrests, seizures, the empire collapsing like a house built on sand. But Edward was safe, legally separated from it all, free. Wallace's phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number with coordinates and new documents, his handler helping him disappear. The price of redemption was everything. 6 months later, Edward and Aviana stood in the airport terminal, about to leave for a delayed honeymoon. Aviana's phone rang, her FBI handler. Did he take the deal? Yes, he's gone. And the recordings? Aviana looked at Edward, at her husband who'd chosen love over legacy, who'd entered violence to protect her but still tried to wound rather than kill. She made her final choice. Lost in the chaos, no usable evidence. She hung up, and Edward raised an eyebrow. You're letting him go? Really? The cycle has to end somewhere. She took his hand, placed it on her belly, where their child was just beginning to show. This baby will never know the violence that brought us together. That's enough revenge. The postcard arrived at their new home 3 months later. No return address, no explanation. Just Wallace's handwriting. Some fathers give their sons a legacy. I gave you freedom. Use it wisely. They read it together, standing in the nursery they were preparing. Do you hate him? Aviana asked. Edward was quiet for a long moment. I hate what he did. I love who he tried to be at the end. I don't know if those two things can exist together, but they do. They burned the postcard in the fireplace, watched the past become ash. Their child kicked, strong, insistent, alive, a future built on choices instead of blood. Somewhere in South America, Wallace watched the sunset from a small villa. He had a new name, a new life, no power and no empire. His hands were finally clean, though the stains on his soul would never wash away. He kept one photograph, Edward and Aviana's wedding announcement from a society page, before everything had gone wrong. They looked happy, hopeful. His son had escaped. Wallace smiled, sad and genuine. He'd lost everything except the only thing that mattered. He'd saved his son's soul.